Hello again, boys and girls. This is Morales. This is chapter 34.3, the end of World War I. So, objectives, factors that led to the end, the influenza epidemic, that's a random thing, and then understand the effects that World War I had on Europe and around the world, in particular the Treaty of Versailles and its impact. So, here we go. Alright, the collapse of the Russian Empire. So, it's February, Russia's in the middle of the war, they're getting their butts kicked just really, really bad. There was a saying going on during the war that for every 3 Russian soldiers, they would get 1 rifle, and then the other 2 would go, "What about us?" And the sergeant would say, "Don't worry. When the guy in front of you dies, pick up his gun and you'll have your own gun." So they were terribly trained, terribly supplied, terribly all this stuff, and they just don't want don't want to fight in a war anymore. A revolution breaks out back in Russia, and we got 2 dates because they changed their calendar. So there's an adjustment to their calendars. So February Revolution is the same as the March Revolution. That's in 1917. That's when the Tsar steps down out of power and a provisional government takes over, using the Duma that was set up earlier for some sort of representation. And this provisional government's going to run things until there's a government elected and they get the act together. So the people running the provisional government are trying to set it up so they honor the commitments that they had, in particular to the war. They're also hesitant to change anything because they don't feel they have the right to do that because they're not the elected government, so they're holding off for that. Well, that's not fast enough for a couple of groups of people, in particular the Soviets, who are small groups of workers/soldiers organization, almost like unions in each of the major cities. They want fast, immediate change, and it's not happening fast enough. So they're the ones that are going to argue on the basis of bread, land, and liberty, something like that, one of those 3. Check your book on that. But they want more immediate change, things that the provisional government is hesitant to do at this time because, once again, they don't feel they have the power to do that because they're not the elected government. So there's a second revolution that takes place in October, this one inspired by Lenin. Lenin had been hanging out in Germany because he was afraid to be in Russia because he was an agitator, and so he was afraid he was going to be locked up by the Tsar and sent to Siberia, which he probably would have. So the Germans, very keenly are aware of this, and so they ship him into Russia because they can control the trains, knowing that he'll cause problems and either slow things down in Russia or mess them up or pull Russia out of the war because he's very much against the war in Russia. He's not anti-war like your book says. He's anti this war, World War I. He thinks it's bad for Russia. Eventually, Lenin and his groups, the Bolsheviks, take over. That's right, Bolsheviks. You get to say it in class. They take over, and they sign this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which I have no idea if I'm saying it right. But anyways, basically it's a terrible deal for Russia, but it gets them out of the war. It's a great deal for Germany, because not only do they get a huge chunk of the Russian territory, they also get Russia out of the war, so they no longer have to fight on the east. This is not good news for the Allies, because now the Germans don't have to split their forces on east and west, and they can send the troops over to the west. So things are still going to happen here. This brings the U.S. into the war, because one of the qualms that the U.S. had about not getting into the war says that they couldn't fight with a monarchy on their side. Well, Russia was a monarchy. Russia's not in the war anymore. Russia's out of the war. No more monarchy. So now the U.S. can enter, and the U.S. is going to enter on the side of the Allies, and this is going to be repeated in World War II because the U.S. is doing tons of business with the Allies. Yeah, they're doing business on both sides, selling to the Central Powers and the Allies, but the majority of their money or their business is going to the Allies. They end up loaning billions of dollars to the Allies and only millions to the Central Powers, so it's not too complicated to do the math. Okay, you would invest millions of dollars, spend it, if you knew you were going to get billions, and that's exactly what the U.S. is doing. So they sell tons and tons of weapons and equipment and stuff to the Allies, mainly because they can't be doing it because they're involved in the war. The Allies rack up huge debts that they owe the Americans, and then it gets to the point where the Americans realize, when they probably already knew this was going to happen, or to some extent, that, look, if the Allies lose, we lose billions of dollars because they will not pay us back. If the Central Powers lose, we lose only millions with an M. once again, for you math majors, billions is quite a bit more than millions, so you don't want to lose billions. The German blockade of the British overseas trade is the thing that's stopping some of the trade. The submarine patrols, the sinking of the Lusitania, all these are other issues that help to encourage America to get in on the war against Germany. But the biggest factor is really easy. It's the amount of money that's involved in here. So the Germans are doing whatever they can to stop Britain from getting supplies, because the supplies come to the U.S., they go to Britain, they get American bullets into British guns, okay, and they're shooting at German soldiers. So the Germans do what they can with their U-boats, and they sink the American ship before the American bullet gets to the British soldier. Okay, this is not viewed very nicely. They say that's not a nice way to fight. Go figure. And so America complains. The Germans say, okay, we'll stop doing that. They stop for a little while, and then they continue because they're in the middle of war. Eventually, on May 7th, the sinking of the Lusitania, that's like the straw that broke the camel's back. The Germans have attacked again. America gets very upset. Okay, once again, more ships are lost again later on in 1916, and America finally enters the war now that Russia has left. And so the U.S. take the place of Russia, which at this time is very good, because the Russians are essentially tapped out, and America brings its full force of its economic and industrial power to bear. The Americans are going to take their sweet time getting ready. They enter the war in April 1917, but they don't get any soldiers there until late in the year, and not really until 1918 do they really show up in force. Okay. The defeat of Central Powers, like we said before, it's a war of attrition. Who could dish it out? Who could take it the most? Not dish it out. Who could take out the most? So the fact that the U.S. enters on the Ally side shows the Germans that, you know what, it's just not going to happen. Had the Americans not get involved, the Germans might have had a chance to defeat Britain and France, but with the American entry in it, it's just an overwhelming amount, a mass of resources and people to fight. By the fall of 1918, the Central Powers are exhausted. The Ottomans are starting to sign a treaty. They're pulled out of the war. Bulgaria is pulled out of the war. Austria-Hungary is pulled out of the war. The only one left fighting is Germany. And eventually, by November, they were ready to give in. So they signed this thing called an armistice. An armistice is a ceasefire. And it's convenient for us. It's an easy day to remember. On the 11th hour, on the 11th day, of the 11th month of 1918, well, it has two ones in it too, they sign a treaty, or they say that that's when they'll stop fighting. So this is signed a couple of days before. It's all finalized so that they have a couple of days to send it out to the troops who, once again, they don't have cell phones, so they have to do it by birds and carrier pigeons and maybe some ninjas bringing the message across. So that's essentially the end of the war, the end of the fighting, but not the peace treaty. That's going to be causing more issues without the bullets. And then our random stuff. Random influenza epidemic hits during 1918 to 1919. Sometimes kids don't believe me because it's a small tidbit. It's a section, I think it's like two paragraphs in your book. In other books, it's a big thing. But this one has a bigger impact, sort of, because it kills more people than World War I, and it takes place all over the world. So somewhere around January 1918 and running to 1920, but for the most part, it dies out in the middle of 1919. 20 million people are going to be killed. That's what your book said. If you take a look at this stuff, revised estimates go as high as 50 million, so it's probably somewhere in between. Just India alone by itself is going to lose 17 million people to this epidemic. It's a flu type thing. Apparently people got it. They got really sick. Those people that are going to survive recovered within like about 2 weeks. Those people that didn't were dead at the end of the 2 weeks. So if you make it past week 2, you're alive. If you don't, well, you don't have to worry about it. In particular, it takes a big, huge wipeout effect in the Pacific Islands. And then with all the close contact with the war, and people having more and more contact because they're trading and dealing with stuff, it helps to spread it further and further. Just so for a point of reference, in the United States alone, it kills somewhere around 675,000 people all across the United States, and that's more up than all the wars that the United States had up until then. And remember that the Civil War killed 600,000 people prior to this, in the 1861, 1865. It's also known as the Spanish flu, so that's another thing you might see it referenced here because that's the first recorded outbreak of the flu. The Paris Peace Conference. This is the thing that's going to set up things. This is a precursor to what's going to happen and lead up to World War II. So make sure you're paying attention to how this flows. Okay, France, Great Britain, and U.S. are going to be the groups that dominate. There's a whole bunch of other countries, I think like 23 groups in there, but these three guys are going to dictate what happens. The U.S. goes in with this guy named Woodrow Wilson, who's our president, and he's all happy, and he thinks it's going to be the war to end all wars. France and Great Britain go in with a different thing. They want revenge on Germany for having started the war. France in particular wants to make sure that Germany does not get powerful and ever do any type of military attack. Great Britain wants to take away all economic power from Germany because that was their rival. They don't invite the Central Powers because they would say, hey, don't do that to us. Also, Russia doesn't show up, which leaves kind of a gap because they were part of the Allies for a while, but since they split off and did their socialism, we're out of the world picture type thing, things are going to be different. Essentially, France, Great Britain start to dictate a peace. It says it's kind of like when your parents talk to you about what you're going to do this weekend because you've been bad, and they're talking about you but not inviting you into conversations, kind of one of those. Germany's going to get to sign this. They're going to have no choice. They're threatened with invasion if not. And this is one of the hiccups, that one of the reasons Germany decided to throw in the towel was that they were under the impression that they were going to get the 14 points that Wilson stated, and I'll go over those in the next thing, thinking that that would be okay, self-determination and that kind of a just peaceful settlement that's kind of more not so mean or harsh. Well, that's not the case. To clarify Wilson's 14 points, Wilson is the American president who seriously wanted to make this the war to end all wars, and it's really not going to happen. So he issues his statement for the 14 points, knowing that the war is soon over, America's now joined, and it will end. And his idea was that when the war's over, if we do this, it'll help prevent any future big world wars. So the main points are open treaties, freedom of the seas, free trade, no tariffs, arms reduction, a readjustment and readjust colonies fairly. So all the colonies that the Europeans had taken over, they're going to squab over those and do those fairly. And then self-determination for all. That's the one thing that the groups thought they were going to get. So the people get to decide their own government. And then this last thing that he was big on, the League of Nations. And this is all going to kick into kind of slap in the face for Wilson. Most of the points are not followed, and they're only followed when it's convenient for Great Britain and France. Here's our map. Take a look at this stuff right here. This is Poland. Didn't exist before. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. All these are carved out of Austria and Hungary. Germany used to have this big area. They lose parts of it, chunks of it. And this place in purple over here is called the demilitarized zone. That's going to be the start of World War II, and an area called Alsace-Lorraine. All these are areas that are being created because of World War I. Countries that were not really countries or nations before, carved out of the territories of Russia and Austria-Hungary and chunks from the Soviet Union from that treaty that they signed. So the Ottoman Empire signs a separate treaty, and there's going to be a whole series of separate treaties. You don't need to know all of them, but definitely the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Sèvres, signed between the Ottomans and the fighting groups, the Allies. So this removes the Balkan and Arab provinces. So the Ottomans, because they lost, are going to lose a big chunk of territory, and essentially sets it up so that the Europeans get to dominate and control and check and make sure that the Ottoman Empire is never going to be powerful. They want to control that Bosphorus Straits to control Russia, because already Russia's on the bad side because they're certain socialists. So the Ottoman king, Sultan, signs that. The Ottoman people don't like that, especially this guy named Mustafa Kemal. He's the guy that was the leader of the military. So he essentially starts a revolt and says, we're not signing that. And then he eventually takes over the Ottoman Empire and sets up what's going to be called the Republic of Turkey. He's so successful at kicking out the European groups that are trying to do that, and they don't want to get to another brawl, that they say, okay, fine, we'll sign a treaty with you. Here's this. And they offer the Treaty of Lausanne. That one you need to know. So Sèvres, not accepted by Kemal. He fights. He gets a new treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne, which reduces the size of the territory but sets up Turkey. And he's going to run a very secular government. In other words, kick out the Islamic forces or the Islamic influence in there, and more liberal, including the right to vote for women.